Today on Flashpoints, a former British ambassador calls for the freeing of Julian Assange and weighs in on Russiagate madness. And a new short film, Locked In, about the plight of political refugees in Great Britain. I'm Dennis Bernstein with my guest host from New York City, Randy Credico, live on the fly. All this coming up straight ahead on Flashpoints. Stay tuned. And you're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. My name is Dennis Bernstein. Well, we start off the show with an interview with the former ambassador to Uzbekistan from Great Britain. That's Greg Murray. Greg Murray is an author, broadcaster, human rights activist. And as I said, he was the ambassador to Uzbekistan from Britain from 2002 to October 2004. And again, Randy Credico as well. Welcome back. Mr. Ambassador, it's good to have you on Flashpoints.
It's very good to talk to you, then.
All right. Well, I was thinking, before we bring Randy in, he's got a whole battery of questions. We're sort of in the middle of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and some people are thinking about the dangers of nuclear war. Are you concerned with this Russiagate frenzy and the quest to push Trump into war, that we could end up in World War III?
Well, there's always a danger when confrontation is deliberately stoked between nuclear-armed powers. The whole anti-Russian propaganda frenzy that's going on at the moment is really quite extraordinary because it's based on very little, and certainly the Russiagate scandal has nothing behind it. It has no factual basis. But it's really a continuation of what had been an upping of the ante on anti-Russian propaganda that's been dominating political discourse in the United States for several years now. And of course that's very much in the interest of the armaments industry. We talk of nuclear war and the threat of confrontation between nuclear-armed powers, and there's always the danger, particularly in Syria at the moment, for example, that accidental military confrontation could escalate at any moment, really. But of course, we have to remember that there are those who benefit enormously from extra spending on armaments, from extra spending on the armed forces, and that these forces are the people pushing the agenda and pushing the hate.
Talking about the heat and pushing the heat, you've been pretty strong weighing in on the Russiagate frenzy. We've been doing sort of a poll asking some of our cherished guests whether they consider what happened in the United States as a leak or a hack. Are you a leak person or are you a hack person? And why?
In my case, through my association with WikiLeaks, of which I'm not a member, but I'm a friend and associate, I know for sure that it was a hack, and it was a hack it was a leak and not a hack.
A leak.
It's definitely a leak, and it's definitely not an external hack. There's been some interesting verification on that you can find online. There are some interesting articles published by Ray McGovern and others detailing some forensic work that showed that the speed of download was such that it couldn't have been an external hack. And of course, Bill Binney, former technical director of the NSA, has stated that were it actually a hack, then the NSA would be able to pinpoint it and tell you the very second it happened. But in fact, there's no such evidence because it wasn't a hack. And I know, for certain that this is not something that WikiLeaks got from a foreign state or from hackers. No, there's no doubt at all that this is an internal leak. Remember, of course, you're talking of two separate things in the DNC emails and the Podesta emails. So it would be wrong to presume there's only one leaker.
And, okay, you're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. Also joining us is Randy Credico. We've been doing a series of joint broadcasts. He is the host of Live on the Fly, coming out of New York City. And, Randy, you have been watching the work of Craig Murray for some time. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you see his significance and jump in here?
Well, Craig Murray is also the author of 3 great books, a biography called Secundra Burns on Alexander Burns, who pretty much is a Craig Murray character from the first Afghan Anglo War, which ended in disaster, then for the Brits. And then he has a great book called The Catholic Orangeman, which I am reading again. And his first book is a memoir on his life in Uzbekistan called Murder in Samarkand. All of these are available at Amazon, and they're very educational and very entertaining. Craig, let's take a look at this so-called leak investigation here in terms of WikiLeaks. And is this just a ruse or an artifice to cover up their real motivation with Russia, which would be that they want to destroy the country, break it into small states, or embargo them and not let them get involved in the world oil supply?
I would say I'm not sure they actually want to break up Russia. Their rhetoric might sound that way, but actually they rather like having a reasonably strong Russia because it gives them, of course, the excuse to invest enormous amounts of money in armaments and to make profits from the armaments industry. So, if you like, the militarist forces on both sides, and we shouldn't deny that Russia has militarist forces too, and has an arms industry too, and people who benefit from the arms industry too. By and large, both sides like to play up the strength of the other and portray the other as evil and powerful, and I think that's what we have primarily going on here. Yes, there are power games in which the United States likes to be seen to be winning, and that hasn't happened in a while in both Syria and the Ukraine. The United States has appeared unusually impotent, let's put it that way, in attempting to get one over on Putin. So Putin seems to be the master recently of the diplomatic games. But we should also not forget that all of these people, including Putin and including Trump and including the establishment of both countries, they're all part of the global 1%. And that the way they invest their money and where their money is kept and where these people live and where these people socialize, it all very much makes them a part of the same club in an interconnected world. So we shouldn't be too distracted by the smoke and mirrors that the global elite erect. And while these are very, very dangerous games to play, the people playing them mostly have some quite cozy relationships behind the scenes.
Well, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks seem to be the fall guy in all of this. Your relationship with Julian Assange, you go back, you were there on, I believe, June 19th, the 5-year anniversary of him being ensconced inside the Ecuadorian embassy. Tell us about your relationship with Julian Assange and the conditions that he is now living under.
Yeah, well, I've known Julian for quite a few years now. From my position as myself being a whistleblower, I left the British Foreign Service in order to blow the whistle on torture and extraordinary rendition, and on the illegality of the war in Iraq. And we have something of a club of whistleblowers, if you like, of which I suppose you'd say that Dan Ellsberg is the kind of patron of us, and we all connect together, and obviously WikiLeaks, which is the best publisher for whistleblowers, is very important to us. So, yeah, I've known Julian that way. I've been appalled by the treatment of Julian. I've been appalled by the evidently nonsensical charges that he was fitted up with in Sweden. I'm so delighted, but I shouldn't say charges, allegations. They never actually led to charges. I'm delighted that that pretend investigation has now been formally dropped, and I'm very sad indeed that there's this continued persecution, really, of WikiLeaks headed from the United States, where, of course, an awful lot of people, they saw the dreadful American war crimes that were exposed by the leaks believed to be perpetrated by Chelsea Manning. An awful lot of people don't like the light that WikiLeaks shines on the dark places of government. But, in the land which purportedly puts free speech and freedom of the media as a great virtue and something to be upheld, it's a dreadful shame to see persecution of a publisher, because that's what Julian is. And then, of course, you have the whole other question of the completely and utterly nuts Russian hacking, Russian leaks, which really was just a kind of propaganda excuse for Hillary Clinton's absolutely useless and appalling election campaign and election performance. So, all these things come together, and they make unlikely allies who have ganged up on Julian Assange from the establishment side of both major parties in the United States.
What is in wake of the current results of the UK elections? What does that foretell for Julian's fortune?
Well, nothing good at the moment. In the we still have the Conservative Party in power, and now they're in alliance with the Democratic Unionist Party, who are the most retrograde, religiously motivated, peculiar religious party here, who are anti-gay. They are creationists. They're very strange. So they, of course, tilt the government even further to the right than it was before. In the medium to longer term, very strong performance by Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party under Jeremy's leadership, which is a breath of fresh air and quite radical compared to anything else in the last several decades of British politics. That may well lead, because the government has a very, very shallow majority. It's unlikely it will last 5 years. And we may see a reversal of the political situation in the United Kingdom.
You're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. My name is Dennis Bernstein. Joining us from New York is Randy Credico, host of Live on the Fly. And we're delighted to have with us the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who has taken, Craig Murray, who's taken a very strong stand about the persecution of WikiLeaks. Now, one of the issues that WikiLeaks confronts head-on is the endless war that the United States has been raging in, wars, I should say, but in Iraq in particular. And it is interesting that Tony Blair was just given a free ride. He was being investigated for lying you all and all of us into that Iraq war. Do you want to talk about the significance of Tony Blair? He was absolved today, but I don't think you think he was innocent of getting us into an illegal war.
Well, interestingly, what the High Court said in the UK was, in a recent judgment, is that there is no crime of aggression in domestic UK law. They acknowledged that it is a crime in international law, but they said that that international crime has never been entered into British domestic law by any act of Parliament. Therefore, you can't actually enforce it in the UK. So it was a very technical acquittal, you might call it. It wasn't actually on trial, but they're not saying he's innocent. What they're saying is that the legislation has never been enacted to make that international war crime a crime in British domestic legislation. That's quite extraordinary in many ways, because the United Kingdom, for example, was one of the 3 countries that constituted the Nuremberg tribunal, and the crime of war of aggression was the main charge before the Nuremberg tribunal, and the United Kingdom participated fully in that process. So for the High Court to rule that the United Kingdom accepts the existence of a law of aggression and can prosecute it internationally, but does not accept its existence to apply domestically, is illogical and really a disgusting piece of special pleading. And the High Court judges are just part of the establishment ganging together to protect Tony Blair and making asses of themselves, frankly, with this very strange ruling that it's a crime we can, as a nation, as a state, it's a crime Britain recognises externally but does not recognise internally.
Now, Tony Blair wants to be sort of, he's played a secret role, sometimes not so secret role, in sort of rolling the dice around who's going to control the massive oil resources in the Middle East and in other places that you're familiar with. You want to talk about what he's really been up to, this guy?
I think, since leaving office, he's primarily been concerned with making money for himself on really a very large scale. He's now worth hundreds of millions. It's fairly obvious that the actions which he undertook with regard, in particular, to Iraq, with regard to Libya and other countries while he was in office, were all aimed at promoting the interests of British and other Western oil companies in particular, energy companies, mercenary companies, armaments companies. And of course, he famously, while Prime Minister, blocked the prosecution. We don't have as clear a separation of powers as you do in the States. I realize in the States there's an element of myth about separation of powers anyway, but it exists there to a greater extent than it does here. And here the Prime Minister and the state was able to stop the prosecution of our largest armaments company, British Aerospace, for paying billions of dollars in bribes to Saudi princes in order to gain arms contracts, on the grounds that that would be against the national security interest because it would damage our alliance with Saudi Arabia. And that was one instance where, when Blair was Prime Minister, he intervened directly to aid the armaments industry and stop an anti-corruption persecution. And since he's left office, what he's done is been cashing in on all this. He's, picked up no end of consultancies and directorships, and he's completely shameless. He's a consultant to the president of Kazakhstan, for example, which is a very nasty dictatorship. And one of the things which has become public by a leak was that he was advising the president of Kazakhstan on how to handle public relations after the Kazakh forces massacred coal miners for going on strike. And here's Blair, who used to represent a coal mining district and had, as a cuckoo in the nest, worked through the British Labour Party, advising on how to do a good PR cover-up of the massacring of coal miners. So the man is completely unprincipled. He's just out to get whatever money he can. I don't think he has much power nowadays. I wouldn't claim he plays a central or pivotal role. I think he rather prostitutes himself to any one of the very wealthy, particularly people in rather dubious countries with poor human rights records, who view it as helpful to be able to cash in on his global image.
You're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. We're speaking with Greg Murray. He's the former ambassador from Great Britain to Uzbekistan, and I'm joined by Randy Credico of Live on the Fly.
feel strongly about.
To survive in a world of destruction. Tough when you're young, beating the system for justice. Open your eyes into pure devastation. It is this. At the bottom, hard to survive in a world of destruction. Tough when you're young, beating the system for justice. Open your eyes into devastation. It is this. Once I had a dream, we were young and once invincible. Once I had a dream, no formal.
Randy Credico from New York. We're talking with Craig Murray. Craig Murray, the ex-ambassador to Uzbekistan for the FCO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Great Britain. I want to talk about Uzbekistan. We were talking about the war logs and what they exposed in Afghanistan. Well, you got to see firsthand torture and death in Uzbekistan. Can you talk about that, Craig?
Yeah, I mean, it really is. It's very different to talk about it and know about it intellectually, and to come face to face with it, and to come face to face with people who are mutilated and crippled as a result of torture, who'll never walk again, whose lives have been substantially shortened, and of course come to face with death. And one of the cases I came across within a month of my first arriving in Uzbekistan was where we got detailed photos of a guy who'd been killed in one of the big prison camps in Uzbekistan, the Jazlik Gulag. And this guy had been boiled alive, literally. We had very detailed photographs of the corpse, which we sent back to the chief pathologist in the UK, and we got a detailed pathological report based on the photos, and they say he died of immersion in boiling liquid. And it was immersion rather than splashing, because there's a very clear tide line around the upper chest and upper limbs, and 100% scalding below. And that he'd been alive when he'd been placed in the boiling liquid. So that sort of thing obviously jolts you. It makes you realize just what it really means when people talk of torture. And there's no doubt at all that the CIA were actively colluding in the work of the Uzbek security services. To a large extent, they were financing it. There were hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. taxpayers' money put into the Uzbek security services. And the CIA was getting the intelligence, so-called intelligence, from those torture sessions. And as the CIA shared their intelligence with MI6, I was seeing it as well. And it's not something we asked the U.S. Embassy directly, and they confirmed that they were obtaining intelligence from what they called detainee interrogations in Uzbekistan. And I also discovered that the CIA were flying people into Uzbekistan under the Extraordinary Rendition Program in order for them to be tortured. And in, I think, pretty well every case of detainees who were flown into Uzbekistan, they were never seen again. They were killed. in effect. I should say that at the time, and I protested in writing about this to London. I entered written protests about what was happening, and in particular about the Americans flying in people to be tortured. I should say at that time, I presumed that all the people being flown in to be tortured were Uzbeks who'd been captured abroad and were being flown back to their own country. I hadn't realized that the Americans were flying in other nationals to Uzbekistan in order for them to be tortured by the Uzbek security services. I discovered that later when the Council of Europe, after I'd left the Foreign Office, when the Council of Europe and other bodies were doing investigations into the extraordinary rendition program. That was just so awful, it just hadn't occurred to me that could be happening, that you'd actually be flying people with no connection to Uzbekistan in order to torture them. So, yeah, it was pretty extreme.
What were they trying to elicit from these people that were being tortured?
They were making them confess to membership of Al-Qaeda in virtually every single case, and to the existence of, widespread terror plots to attack Western countries. And I should say that I'm convinced to a 99% certainty that every one of these stories was untrue. I never saw any intelligence at all that checked out against any other known facts. And very often there were things which I knew was untrue. The favourite example I often give is one professor in Tashkent was named as being a member of Al-Qaeda. And I knew the man. I'd actually had dinner with him, and he was a Jehovah's Witness, which makes him a very unlikely member of Al-Qaeda. But, often I could show the information was wrong. But the object of it was to exaggerate the threat. The object of it was to allow national authorities to say, Al-Qaeda is an enormous threat. We have foiled 2,000 potential terror plots. But the whole object of it was to exaggerate the threat from Al-Qaeda because, of course, that was the justification for the aggressive foreign policy. That was the justification for all these invasions, and it was the justification for the Homeland Security Act and legislation restricting civil liberties at home. The Al-Qaeda... I was talking earlier about how the people who want to make a lot of money from the armaments industry need a strong Russia they can point at. Similarly, the security industry, the security services, those who would restrict our internet freedoms and other freedoms or clamp down on freedom of publication, those people needed a strong terrorist threat in order to justify their actions. And what they were doing in sending people to be tortured was manufacturing the false existence of a terrorist threat, manufacturing false confessions that gave the narrative which they wished us to hear.
At what point did you decide that you had had enough and you went public with it, and what happened when you went public?
Yeah. I fairly quickly decided I'd had enough. I should say, this was after a 20-year diplomatic service career, which had been really very stellar. I was, I think, Britain's youngest ambassador at the time I was appointed in a service, rather old-fashioned diplomatic service, in which it was quite hard to get to be an ambassador when you're young. But I arrived in August, I think, and I think by December I was sending back internal top-secret telegrams protesting against this that were phrased so strongly they were bound to get me sacked. Let me put it that way. But I should say, in some ways, I consider myself a bit of a fraud as a whistleblower because I protested internally. I did everything I could within the system to stop it. And what I was working on was the idea that these actions are illegal. We are colluding in these actions by also receiving the intelligence, so we are also acting illegally. If I can get this before government lawyers, the government lawyers will advise the government that really we've got to stop doing this because it's against the law and we shouldn't be doing it. So I was trying to pull all the levers I knew of, if you like, internal civil service politics in order to get it stopped. And it was when... And the government then reacted to that by doing, to me, essentially the same kind of thing they've done to Julian Assange. Suddenly I found that I was up on charges of trying to extort sex from visa applicants, of being a habitual alcoholic, and all these other disciplinary charges suddenly appeared against me after, a 20-year unblemished career. They suddenly discovered I was actually a psychopathic alcoholic.
Let me just jump in here, Ambassador Murray. Dennis Bernstein here with Randy Credico, and I want to, in one moment, I want to ask you about another either or. Was it Russian aggression or a U.S. coup in the Ukraine? But regarding the torture, that which you witnessed and tried to report up the chain, what would be your understanding of how high in, say, the U.S. levels of government it would be known that there was this was policy, that the rendition, that the torture, that the level of torture, that the kind of treatment, who would have known? Would that have gone all the way up the chain to the president? What would you say about that?
Yeah. Well, in the UK, I know for certain it did go all the way up the chain as far as Tony Blair, because I made sure my protests did, if you see what I mean. And I was, when I was being told to stop it and shut up, I was told in no uncertain terms that this had all been authorized from the very top, so I should just get back in my box. I know for a certainty in the UK it went as high as Tony Blair, the authorization of the torture program. In the States, I know for certain it went as high as Donald Rumsfeld, because Brigadier Janice Karpinski, who was scapegoated to events at Abu Ghraib, she told me that she had personally seen orders authorizing torture techniques signed by Donald Rumsfeld himself. So it certainly went as high as Rumsfeld. The lawyers who were drafting stuff on what torture techniques are permissible certainly passed those by George W. Bush, so he certainly approved those. The pinning the rendition program itself and the shipping of people around the world on Bush personally, I've got no doubt he did it, but I've never seen 100% undeniable proof of that. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means I haven't seen it. But I know to a certainty it went as high as Blair in the UK, and I'm sort of I believe very strongly it went as high as Bush in the United States.
These would call for war crimes investigations, international tribunals. We never saw any of that. Now, I want to direct your attention again to this. The Ukraine, that's the excuse we hear from the leftist, warmonger, liberal, I don't even know what to call these people anymore. But the Russians took over Ukraine. They subverted the government there. We have no choice to move in and do whatever we can, because that was obviously Russian aggression in the extreme. Was it Russian aggression? Was this a U.S. sort of soft coup?
I'm actually quite critical of both parties in the Ukraine, to be perfectly honest. I think that, there's no doubt whatsoever that the United States was interfering very strongly in Ukrainian politics, was backing one side in the Ukrainian political divide, and was putting in an awful lot of money and resources, and was very much behind the unconstitutional ousting, in effect, of a sitting president. On the other hand, I also think the Russians moved to supporting levels of violence that they didn't really need to do at the stage that they did it. So I very often find myself, I actually get quite criticised on the left a bit, because the left has become very pro-Putin in reaction, I suppose, to the lies of the right. But there's a danger of overcompensation and painting Putin as a saint, which he certainly isn't. So yes, the US was engaged, undoubtedly, in attempts at a coup, which, let's face it, I mean, one of the hilarious things about the US accusing Russia of interfering in their election is that the United States has been doing that abroad in scores of countries for decades and decades and decades. And the United States undoubtedly was interfering to an illegitimate degree in what was happening in Ukraine. But I don't absolve Russia of all blame for the situation either.
Randy, we're running out of time. Final question?
Yes, I guess. I was going to ask you about your involvement in the negotiations, the peace negotiations in Sierra Leone back in 1998, and your involvement, not involvement, but your running across this guy Spicer from Sandline, who was an arms merchant. He ran these what were called military companies, which were mercenaries. He's there, and then he goes to Iraq and is involved with this group called Aegis. Can you just encapsulate that period in a few minutes here?
Yeah. Spicer, together with a guy called Tony Buckingham, were in charge initially of a company called Executive Outcomes, which was based on former British Special Forces personnel who sold themselves particularly to oil companies in Angola and other oil-rich African states, and in order to physically take control of oil resources in civil war areas, and they perpetrated an awful lot of atrocities, particularly machine gunning of villages, for example, from helicopters. I came across them. They moved on after Executive Outcomes to a company called Sandline, which had entered a very, very crooked deal to take control of the diamond resources of Sierra Leone. And my involvement, as head of the UK delegations for Sierra Leone peace negotiation, it's a long and complicated story I won't go into now, but it was quite sickening, the desire of Western companies and Western governments to get out of it access to Sierra Leone's diamond and titanium resources, and to ignore the genuine grievances of many of the Sierra Leonean people, which had lain behind an awful lot of the conflict. So that was all, years before I came across the terrible happenings in Uzbekistan. That was all quite disillusioning. And then to see some quite senior Western politicians who I name in my book on this, The Catholic Orangeman, becoming directors of those major mineral resource companies in their personal capacity shortly after the peace deals were reached, again, was pretty disillusioning. And then, of course, the Executive Outcomes and Sandline mercenaries went on to really strike the jackpot in Iraq, where they had a private mercenary company called Aegis, which worked for both the United Kingdom and the United States governments at different times, and had tens of thousands of mercenaries in Iraq, where, again, they were involved in a number of atrocities, and the people responsible made billions of dollars out of it, billions of dollars from the privatization of killing, because that's what mercenaries are. It's the privatization of killing. It's the ultimate privatization. So all of that is quite startling and far too little known.
Well, Ambassador, I just want to, we just have a minute left, and I want to swing you back around to where we started. What do you think the importance is, the significance of having Julian Assange free? Not that he's been hindered all that much. He seems to be doing a great deal from being held up in that embassy. But what is the importance of a Julian Assange in this first part of the 21st century in the context of what we see and what is called mainstream journalism? What's at stake here?
Well, I think Julian is a major figure, probably the greatest single figure in the breaking of the monopoly on what we're allowed to know by by the mainstream media, and the fact that people now increasingly distrust the mainstream media and get their information from an awful lot of other sources, and places where you can get actual direct access to source documentation, which you know is valid, like WikiLeaks, rather than read the opinion of some journalists on it. I think that's very important indeed. And that's where I think some other whistleblowers have made a mistake by going through the mainstream media, who have then acted as gatekeepers on what we find out from those leaks. And I think the Panama Papers was a great example of that kind of lost opportunity.
And go on.
Well, and Julian really, though, is the figurehead for freedom of information, the figurehead for disclosure, the figurehead for holding governments to account. And of course, he's an enormously capable and intelligent and articulate individual who has a tremendous contribution to make to international debate, aside from the materials that he publishes, and he would be able to fulfill that role, obviously, to a much greater degree if he were essentially free. And that, of course, is why the authorities don't want him to be free.
Randy, Dennis Bernstein here. You want to say the final goodbye?
Yes, and once again, we have been joined by Craig Murray, the former ambassador from the UK to Uzbekistan. And 3 books I recommend your listeners, once again, are Murder in Samarkand, his memoir on his life in Uzbekistan, those 4 months. And then you have The Catholic Orangeman. He was talking about Sierra Leone. It is a must-read. And, of course, his classic biography, Sikander Burns.
All right. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm Dennis Bernstein. You're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. Berkeley, I'm Dennis Bernstein. You're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. Well, we're going to meet a filmmaker and take a look at a new short film. Her first, actually. Her name is Nadira Murray. She's an actress. She was born into the theater, really, you could say, in her native Uzbekistan. Her mother was an actress. Her father was an actor, playwright, director. And she was on her way up there in her country, but all of a sudden she found herself in exile. I shouldn't say all of a sudden, but there it was at age 22. She was in Great Britain, and she was not able to return to her country. It seems as your first short, Nadira Murray, has a lot to do with your own experience as somebody being forced into exile. You want to sort of talk a little bit about your background and what you tried to do in the film?
Thanks for having me. As you said pretty much about it, I am from Uzbekistan and I left at the age 23 and I can no longer return. I worked as an actress in Britain and I thought I got interested in human stories, human journeys, and I thought, why not? Why don't I make a film which is a very close subject to my heart in terms of experience and in terms of other people in exile that I left, I know of. So I thought I'd do some research on that and use some facts and use some experience and create characters and bring up my first short film, which is 15 minutes, and talk about social issues, which is very current at the moment. So as a filmmaker, you really need to tell the subject you know well and the world that you know well and you feel and you've kind of experienced. And that came to me quite easily. However, I had to do some research, interviewing NGOs, some police officers, and real asylum seekers, detainees, medical justice doctors, and lawyers who were defending their case, and including my partner, who was a British ambassador to Uzbekistan in 2002. So he also helped more than a couple of asylum seekers in Uzbekistan. So it's all happened in front of my eyes, and it's all happened through my own experience. It's the subject I knew very well, and I thought, you know what, the story of asylum seekers should be told, because nobody actually mentioned that. Everybody talks about refugees, asylum seekers, outsider, but then what about the ones who are already inside in UK, who are trying, who applied for asylum seekers and trying to get through that dehumanizing process? And I thought that story should be told, and then that's how I've come to create this project.
You know, obviously, this subject is crucial these days, and there isn't a great deal of sympathy for asylum seekers. It's a twilight zone. There you are. Tell us a little bit about what your main characters are going through. They're in the process. It looks like they're being fast-tracked, and they're facing torture if they're deported back to their homeland. And this isn't an uncommon story, is it?
Yeah. You know, I know it sounds like a bit heavy political kind of drama, but to be honest, I didn't mean to tell a story about like a political story. I didn't want to touch the system, you know, but I only wanted to tell the human stories and human suffer inside that system when they're stuck between four walls in this Category B prison detention center and waiting for their fate to be decided by a bunch of authorities who who makes a decision about their fate. So I thought, what would be like if you're stuck within four walls and your fate is being decided outside that box, and you're not allowed to go out at all, and then you hear that you have to go back. That was the most terrifying thing to me and most fearful. And I thought, whatever scared me, I thought I'd do a film around that, because as a human being, it just terrified me. And I thought, and when I did a research, when I came across with a lot of people who are on the fast track system, and their stories were like really painful. So I thought I would pick up those human stories, but around that system. So the system detention center in UK, we have this fast track system called fast track system. If you're put on a fast track system, if an asylum seeker put on a fast track system, that means 99.9% asylum seekers are sent back home and to a certain persecutions or death and who knows what. So, but it's very hard to win your case whilst you're on a fast track system, and you could be deported between 2 days and 14 days. So I was only creating my drama within that system, it's called fast track system. And, when I was doing the research and when I wrote this, I wrote it myself based on thorough, deep research. And, in 2015 in September, even High Court said it was unlawful. So they declared it was unlawful. So it's kind of a good news. So it was a very dehumanizing process to go through if an asylum seeker finds themselves in a fast track system. That is the drama I wanted to show.
And indeed it is, and people don't even, unless you've been through it or close to it, you don't have the slightest idea of the nature of the terror. I'm thinking of so many different stories, but this one activist comes home and obviously his mother got in trouble for a stand that the activist himself took. And what does he find at home? Well, it's just the pot is still on the stove cooking, but there's no mother. And the rest of one's life is spent either trying to defend yourself from being deported back to torture, or finding a loved one, trying to figure out whether they're still dead or alive, lost somewhere in the system. So there's so many, and this is now affecting so many people that it's a huge story. So it's sort of a good timing for your work. Where are you hoping to take has it been accepted anywhere yet? Where are you hoping to take the film?
I do hope it will travel well in the festivals. So, this is just the beginning for me, and I'm only looking for a positive side of it, and I hope people will understand that subject matters. When we talk about refugees, about asylum seekers, it's not the ones who are coming in, it's the ones already who are here, already who are in Europe, who are in Britain, who are perhaps in US, and they're trying to go through that asylum-seeking process itself, how difficult it is and how humanizing it could be. And that process is a traumatizing process, and I wanted to highlight that aspect in the film. So, again, it may sound like documentary, but I have a certain style. I really love this style, creating fictionized characters based on a lot of true stories. So I combine it into one voice or two voice, and then I use facts. So I very much love that style. So I try to make it cinematic possible, so it could be entertaining at the same time, and at the same time that you leave the theater finding out a lot of other stuff, what is going on currently So that's kind of my approach, and I think it would do good in festivals. Hopefully, I had a faith on when I made that film. It took me 2.5 years to work on it, but I'm really happy and I did it. So, I hope it will receive a good audience.
And we've been speaking with Nadira Murray. Her film will be showing as a part of the LA Shorts Film Festival. It's airing tonight in Los Angeles, actually at 9:45 p.m. If you're listening from LA, it's in the La Mel NoHo 7 Cinema in North Hollywood. And you can check out her very powerful new short film, Locked In. I'm Dennis Bernstein. You're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio.
That wraps it up for another edition of Flashpoints. Our executive producer is Dennis Bernstein. Our roving producer and producer of Flashpoints in Espanol is Miguel Gavilan Molina. Our technical director is Mike Biggs. For more information about the show, to listen to or download archived episodes, log on to flashpoints.net or visit our SoundCloud page at soundcloud.com/flashpoints. For questions or comments about Flashpoints, you can contact Dennis at dennisjbernstein@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.
Make a smart investment. Support KPFA Radio today. We make the most of every dollar donated by producing truly independent news, analysis, cultural, and public affairs programming. You are essential in keeping that information flowing and KPFA on the air. Invest today. Become a member or an ally as a monthly sustainer. Online today at kpfa.org. And we promise to stay as vigilant as always.
A human rights lawyer who has written The Plot to Scapegoat Russia, Dan Kovalik, believes this anti-Russian campaign is one of the biggest fake news operations in all of U.S. history. He'll be throwing down an instructive challenge to mainstream media in Berkeley on Thursday evening, September 7th, 7:30 at St. John's Presbyterian Church, 2727 College Avenue. There's free parking and wheelchair access. Flashpoints, Kevin Pina will host. Tickets at brownpapertickets.com and supportive bookstores.
It is now 6 o'clock here at KPFA 94.1 FM in Berkeley, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, 97.5 K248BR in Santa Cruz, and always online at kpfa.org.